Hello and welcome to the Selections podcast by Select Investors. I'm your host, David Reynolds, and we are joined here today by Martin Rimmer from Spice Taxation. Welcome, Martin.
Thanks, David. Good to be here.
Excellent. Martin is our UK tax advisor based here in Singapore, so he's very well placed to deal with all UK tax-specific requirements that we have for our clients. For the record, we're recording this on Monday, the 20th of March, following the UK Spring Budget update on Wednesday, 15th of March, 2023, last week. There was certainly plenty to talk about within the budget update from Jeremy Hunt. So we thought the best way to communicate this was to have a discussion on video for you, because we did host an event in our office on Thursday, the 16th of March, but realized that probably more of you could do with this communication. So I want to start with the economic highlights that were announced, the positive side of the sort of the economic updates from the government that we've not seen for a while. And the UK economy was due to contract by 1.4%, but now is expected to contract less than the expected at 0.2% for 2023. The 2024 forecast will be for positive growth at 1.8%. Inflation by the end of the year is now forecast to be at 2.9%, well down from the current levels, and much closer to the long-run 2% target that will keep the Bank of England satisfied. And the debt to GDP ratio is set to reduce to 92.4% by next year. Martin, in our presentation on Thursday evening following the budget, you highlighted how many budgets we've actually seen from the UK in the last year. In fact, it was just about a year only, delivered by several different chancellors, actually. How do you see the culmination of these from Jeremy Hunt?
Well, I think the first one, Dave, great question, by the way, was obviously the Spring Budget 2022, which is the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor. That was under a Boris Johnson government, which had its own fiscal and monetary policies, very different to what we've got now. We then had the growth budget, which was quasi-Kwarteng after Liz Truss came in, which personally, as a tax guy, I felt there were some really positive tax moves there, but it was poorly communicated, poorly delivered, and not well received by the markets, and we all knew what happened after that. Then we had Jeremy Hunt delivering the November autumn statement, which was really just to put a massive brakes on the growth budget that was announced in September, and then really this spring 2023 budget is Jeremy Hunt's first major fiscal event, where we see him setting much more of a moderate tone. I think overall, I mean, it's when you think about where we've come from and the state of the public finances, we expect many more seismic changes in the tax system. I mean, Ukraine is a thing. COVID is a huge thing. We spent over £500 billion on COVID relief, and the national debt at the end of Q4 2022 was at 96.9%. Absolutely astonishing. It's a record level of GDP, of course. So you think then they're going to have to take lots of steps to raise a lot of money very quickly. But the view I think that Rishi took back in 2022, and this is very much mirrored in 23, is that this is a generational task to pay down this debt. We're not going to take huge chunks out of the debt very quickly. We're going to treat it like war debt. 40, 50, 60, 70, 80-year commitment to get the public finances into a better state. So therefore, he does not need to make massive changes to the tax system. And a lot of the things that we in the tax profession feared, massive seismic changes to inheritance tax, to capital gains tax, introduction of wealth tax, have simply not materialised. So what you have is a set of budgets. If we just take sort of the growth budget September 2022 to one side, very much budgets that tweak the system rather than seek to fundamentally change the system. So that we just got more of the same from Jeremy. Nearly 100 announcements, most of which were really, really small, but there are some biggies in there as well, which I'm sure will come.
Yeah, I think it was generally expected that it was going to be a fairly safe budget, given sort of the reversal of all the quasi-Kwarteng measures, and in fact, some of it swung the other way under Jeremy's first one. So it was deemed that it was going to be okay in this time of higher inflation, etc. Nothing too dramatic that will upset the financial markets, etc. Maybe leave that for
that's a lesson they learned.
yeah, exactly, and maybe leave that for the pre-election budget. The next
Correct.
the next one.
2 more of those before the election.
Exactly. Time to maybe start making people happier with it at that point. However, there were a couple of surprises or a couple of interesting things within there, and we know that these things often kind of get talked about or maybe sort of leaked in part beforehand, but actually some things that weren't this time. So how did we're talking in the subject of the cost of living crisis or inflation? I mentioned that by the end of the year it's forecast to be 2.9%, but it's not at the moment.
No.
So what measures within the budget were laid out to kind of help or support people during this time?
So I think the way that you can look at inflation in a number of different ways, and the way they've chosen to look at it now in terms of the individual consumer, say it's about your cost of living. And if we can get your cost of living down, then yes, naturally inflation will come down. So they announced about 6 or 7 different key measures. I'm going to highlight 3 or 4 of them now. So the most important one, I think, is they're going to extend the energy price guarantee, which was due to be phased out at the end of March and is now going to continue for another 4 months until the end of July 2023, which is when they're saying they expect the wholesale prices of gas to come down quite markedly. And it's funny, although it was only a very small part of the speech, they're also talking about the idea of the UK gradually moving towards energy independence over an extended period of time with a focus on nuclear. Obviously, that won't happen in the next 4 months. Secondly, they're going to freeze fuel duty for the next 12 months, which I think is very welcome. Weirdly, they decided to allocate 163 million quid to keeping sports centres and pools afloat. Public pools afloat. I can't. It's an odd little sort of play on words he used. And then I think the other one that we always like is they've decided to reduce the duty on draft beer in pubs. So it gets more people into pubs. Now, is that a socially good thing? It probably is, isn't it? But it's certainly cheaper to buy draft beer in the pubs than in the supermarkets. So look, tweaking around the edges, but they're effective measures because a lot of people are affected.
Yeah, seem more like not so much necessarily too much in the way of gifts in that regard, because it's more maintaining the guarantee when actually we know energy prices have come down significantly. So hopefully,
just
that
creating a little bit more
just
certainty.
don't take it away, even if you don't need to give it. And the same with the keeping energy duty the same and looking after the pub landlords so they can.
It's a much beloved part of the economy.
Yes, exactly. That keeps most people happy anyway in the UK. With a tight labour market that we're experiencing in the UK, and in fact, a lot of places around the world, and Singapore is no different. What were the main announcements to maybe look at employment?
Yeah, it's good question. The way Jeremy presented the budget was in sequence with Rishi Sunak's own 5 points. I don't know whether you remember when he was petitioning to become Prime Minister, he had a 5-point plan: get inflation down, get it halved by the end of December, so on track to more than achieve that. Grow the economy, didn't stipulate the metrics. Reduce the national debt, didn't stipulate the metrics. NHS waiting list to come down, again, didn't stipulate the metrics. And do something about illegal immigration. So by far and away, the biggest focus of the budget was this grow the economy. And you can grow the economy in a load of different ways. But one of the ways is to focus upon making the labour market more flexible, more movable, getting people into work who want to be into work. So I think there were really 3 areas in which he focused. The first one is he's identified that there are 1 million disabled or long-term sick in the workforce who want to work but don't feel they can because they fear losing benefits. So he is committed to not withdrawing their benefits and to enabling those back into the labour market. They basically said £4,000 per person would be made available to enable them to go back into the labour market. And he cited things like Zoom and Teams and the ability to work from home as being great reasons, because there probably are lots of people who, maybe people who've been very active, who have fallen long-term ill, who are just itching to get back in but aren't quite sure how best to do it. So a really positive thing. This kind of stuff doesn't happen immediately. It'll percolate through over time, but I think fundamentally a really, really good thing. Secondly, for the I think he cited 2 million people who are on benefits but aren't trying hard enough to get work. They're going to apply those rules much more vigorously. Again, probably a good thing. But then he's identified over 3 million people aged over the age of 50. So experienced people. I'm one of those now. Would you believe? Who are out of the workforce, but who would maybe want to come back into the workforce, but can't because perhaps they don't want to, or perhaps the incentives don't exist to allow them to do so. So just a few things. There's this thing called a midlife MOT. They only did 8,000 last year. This year they're going to do 40,000. Okay, that's a small thing. Secondly, they're going to introduce something called returnerships. You know, where we have apprenticeships for kids getting into the market.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Retraining.
Correct. It's how are we going to incentivize people? We're going to give them returnerships with companies, and we don't really know what that means. But also, probably the biggest thing, and this is really where private individuals are impacted, in this whole area of pension savings. So, shall I talk a little bit about that now?
Yeah.
Or did you have a separate question on that? Because I know it's a big.
Well, it's a huge. I mean, obviously, it's a huge part of the budget and the announcements that came out. So let's tackle it now, because obviously a lot of things that happen within the budget affect people that just live in the UK.
Correct. Yeah.
Which is for our British expats here, planning maybe at some point to return, or with family back there, may have significant interest. But really, it's the things in the budget that maybe come up a bit less regularly, that actually impact British citizens or British expats living in Singapore. So let's tackle that. And so
sure.
What was that?
No worries. So you're right. The budget's aimed at domestic audience because that's where the very vast majority of taxpayers are. Sometimes there are intended measures for non-residents, but most of the time we get it's not unintended consequences, but there are some indirect consequences of budget measures that impact us here in Singapore. So I think number one, profoundly positive, is the Chancellor has abolished the lifetime allowance charge with effect from the 6th of April 2023. Now, what's the lifetime allowance and what's the lifetime allowance charge? The lifetime allowance is the maximum value of pension savings across all of your schemes, state pension accepted, that are in the UK, that are allowed to accumulate tax relief. And that's currently set at £1,073,100. Don't know why they set it to that, but that's,
we could go into the detail.
We could go into that. So £1,073,100. If you exceed that, then it's a relevant event. The excess above that's charged tax either at 55% or 25%, depending on how you want to take it.
Yeah.
That is a disincentive to save for retirement, particularly where people have worked a long career and have suddenly been hit by this charge. I think it was 2011 or 12 or something when it came in. But do you remember the year it came in?
I think it was post-financial crisis.
It's definitely post GFC, wasn't it? But they worked 20, 30 years. They built up a great pot, and suddenly they introduce this lifetime allowance charge. So why bother saving? Why bother working when you know your employer is obliged to contribute? That's just creating a tax charge for you. So he's abolished that tax charge, which is fundamentally good news. It means any amount of pension savings can get tax relief within the scheme. There is no charge to tax on the excess. From the 6th of April 2024, I think it'll probably be then the actual lifetime allowance itself will be removed. He's also increased the amount that people can contribute into a UK pension and get tax relief each year. It was £40,000. It's now going to 60. Now, British expats, in the main, can't contribute. Yeah. There are some rules if you've just left the UK. There are some rules if you're, for example, employed by the UK government. Ground servants can continue to contribute. But by and large, you and I can't. Yeah. But it's there as well. And they also have something called a money purchase allowance, where if you've already flexibly accessed your pension benefits, taken money out, they don't really want you to recycle that in and get tax relief. So they limit what you can put into a pension. Was 4, is now going to be 10. So 3 fundamentally good things. There was one other measure they introduced, however, is I think most people will be familiar with the concept that you can take 25% of your pension as a tax-free lump sum. Yeah. Now, depending on the way the scheme is constituted, you might be obliged to do that. you may choose not to, or if you've got one of these flexi access pensions, you can take your 25% lump sum however you want, whenever you want. Very, very flexible. But the Chancellor's decided to restrict the amount that you can take tax-free out of pension scheme to the current lifetime allowance, 1.073 million at 25%, so 268,000-ish, unless you have lifetime allowance protection. And when they introduced the lifetime allowance back in 2011 and 12, they introduced a set of protections that you could apply for: 1.8 million, 1.5 million, 1.25 million. If you have protection at any of those levels, then your tax-free lump sum, tax-free entitlement is 25% of that. So at the moment, you can get protection for 1.25 million, which means your tax-free lump sum can be higher, can go up to £312,500. Now, not everyone has protection, and if you don't know whether you've got protection, well, speak to David, speak to me, we can work that out for you. And even if you don't have it, it's not always right, because you can't contribute to a pension scheme in the UK ever again and keep protection. But there is an opportunity to get it. If you're not going to be contributing until you draw it, get protection. It will increase the amount of the tax-free lump sum that you're entitled to draw over the lifetime of the pension. So these are all good things that make pension saving more attractive, and therefore it removes the disincentive to work.
Yeah.
So you'll have a whole bunch of NHS doctors going back to work now.
So it's the doctors we have to thank for this, isn't it?
It is. It's the doctors who are leaving in droves, and of course that then speaks into trying. One of Rishi's priorities is to get the NHS waiting list down. Well, this will help with that.
Yeah.
Drive tax revenues, and get good, experienced people back into the workforce. Tax was a disincentive at that level, and he's removed that, which I think is profoundly positive.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's often when we talk about getting protections or lifetime allowance protection, because you can get it and then you can give it up if you decide to use it in different ways. But often people think, well, I'm nowhere near that level. I mean, some people are right on it and should be looking at it, but others maybe have been away from UK employment for a while, sit there and look at their pension and go, okay, well, it's only worth X amount. But actually, if you've still got many years before you are due to or potentially going to retire and take any benefit from that pension, it's amazing how quickly that can compound and grow, even with no further contributions to being at that amount.
Absolutely.
So it's really worth inspecting.
No, totally. Depending on how the thing is managed, if you're taking a lot of risk with it, then all other things being equal, you have quite a high return year on year. It doesn't take many years to double your money.
No.
Now, of course, it depends on what's going on in the world, but I think really, it makes sense to get the protection. It's extremely simple to do.
Yeah.
I did one with a client the other day, and she was absolutely gobsmacked. It took us about 2 minutes. And it's a one-time application. It applies to all your pension schemes. And also, once you've got protection, you can still manipulate pension schemes. So if you've got lots of them all over the place, you can still put them together into one.
So it's your protection rather than a specific pension.
Correct. But I also think, as a general thing, if the government's giving you the right to some additional tax-free income, even if you don't think you're going to use it, but you have to apply for it.
Yeah.
It costs nothing.
It's one of those things. My father would always say, it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it.
That's very well put. Yeah.
Yeah. It's and do we have a deadline for this?
No, we don't. Well, they're going to be removing the lifetime allowance charge, he said, at a future fiscal event, whatever that means. So the lifetime allowance itself.
Yeah.
I guess it's at that point the ability to protect at the level of that allowance
Because
will
there's
go.
no allowance to protect against.
Correct. So I would do it as soon as you can.
Yeah.
Really.
So it's not by the end of this tax year, maybe by the end of next tax year.
We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know. They've not said. I think if it were by the end of this tax year, they probably would have said.
Yeah.
They've certainly not made any comment about when people can stop applying for protection. So, but it's a little bit like the national insurance thing. It's best to do it.
Yes.
Do it quickly.
Yeah. And it was missed a lot. I think the fact that there was that little caveat within it. A lot celebrated from many sides. Those removed the lifetime allowance, And obviously, we've seen a bit of media kickback and stuff from the opposition.
Of course,
As
that's
far
their
as
job, though, isn't it?
It is their job, exactly, about that. But then that little bit of information about, okay, well, we're removing the lifetime allowance, but we're not giving you unlimited pension commencement lump sum, or tax-free lump sum, as it's often called, was quite interesting. So essentially, they're removing that sort of top level of additional income tax.
And that wasn't part of the budget speech. That was buried in the detail.
Yes, exactly.
So that's why we didn't get an immediate kickback from Labour, because of course that impacts everybody, whereas the lifetime allowance removal does only impact those with very large pension schemes. So, but okay, there may be a little bit of flex on that in the future.
Yeah. So moving on from the big sort of news that affected everybody, were there any other sort of nuggets of pearls of wisdom or nuggets of information that we could glean from the budget that you saw as useful?
I think the other major announcements are really more about corporation tax. I mean, corporation tax makes it's not as big as income tax in terms of what it generates, but it's in second place, so it's a really, really important thing. So in 2021, just the first budget during COVID, they announced that businesses would be allowed a super deduction, which is 130% of the cost of qualifying expenditure could be written down in the year of the expense. And that was always scheduled to come to an end at the end of March. And it is going to, but they're replacing it now with a much more intuitive thing called full expensing, where 100% of what you spend can be written down in that year. Doesn't that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas normally you'd have capital allowances over many years. They've introduced a raft of R&D incentives as well. The UK is two great stats that came out of the budget. The UK is only the third $1 billion tech economy in the world, and it's the best or the biggest and the fastest growing life sciences hub in Europe. So R&D is brilliant for that, and the UK is genuinely the R&D, at least the R&D centre of Europe. The reliefs are incredible. You get the write down on the expense, and then you get a credit on top of that against your corporation tax. It's absolutely brilliant. So one or two other things. For private individuals like you and I, all of the standard rates and allowances are frozen. So it's still 20%, 40, 45, etc. Capital gains tax remains unchanged.
No inflation giveaways
no,
and raising
nothing
allowances.
Like that. Well, they announced that in the previous budget. They'll be freezing all of that. Inheritance tax allowances remain the same. They've been unchanged since 2008-9. The what they had previously announced, and this is part of Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement, was that the capital gains tax annual allowance would fall from £12,300 to £6,000 with effect from the 6th of April 23, and again down to £3,000 a year after. And the dividend allowance would go from £2,000 to £1,000 on the 6th of April 2023. That was planned, pre-announced. We knew it was coming. But
So
then
that disappointment remained.
That disappointment remained. But British nationals living overseas typically don't need to pay tax on their dividends in the UK. So, and they're typically exempt from capital gains tax, except on the disposed of real estate assets. So, for us over here, we remain largely insulated from it all.
Yeah, brilliant. So I think that's for me, that covers most of the main elements that our clients and those living in Singapore would be most impacted or interested to hear. So thank you very much for sharing those insights.
Pleasure, David.
And to those of you listening, if you do have a UK pension and you'd like us to explore your lifetime allowance options, please do get in touch sooner rather than later. Otherwise, let's hope this spurs the UK economy on to good things in the rest of 2023.
Indeed, they made some pretty bold predictions. Let's hope they all come true.
Yes, that would be great. Forecasts that actually get met.
Indeed. Yeah. Thank you, David.
Thanks,
Great.
Martin.